All right, so this is our first official meeting. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Kira. I am located in North Carolina. Normally, I would have everybody introduce themselves, and we'd have a little bit of time to start. However, we do have a special guest speaker today, so I want to introduce him first, and then the way that we introduce ourselves is going to be more centered around him, and it's going to help him frame his discussion with us today. Okay, so I would like to introduce Mr. Howard Chabner. He is a disability rights lawyer and advocate, and he's also on the board of directors for the FSHD Society. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Kara. So I'll say a little bit about myself, and then I think we do have a small enough group that everybody can introduce themselves. So I'm 65, just turned 65 last summer, which is a sort of a big milestone. I'm not actually a disability rights lawyer. I was mostly a corporate lawyer. I practiced for around 20 years, and I retired on disability around 20 years ago. I live in San Francisco. I'm a Chicago native. In my career, I practiced both at a couple of law firms, large and medium law firms, medium size, and probably the longest job I had was as an in-house lawyer at a equipment leasing company. So essentially, two things that are really obvious that I put down on my document. One is that a treatment for FSHD is on the horizon. So for the age of all of you, even including Lee, who might be at the older end of this group here, and you don't have FSHD anyway, but I think it's important to just bear in mind that for anybody of the ages that are here, and even somebody in their 40s and 50s, it's likely, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but good things are happening. I think you're probably all aware of clinical trials that are taking place and others that are on deck. And so it's very likely that for all of you here, you will have many years left in your careers after a treatment becomes available. So I think, that's something you can't count on it, but it's something to bear in mind. And I think Justin and one other person was in biotech, and so you probably are pretty up on that. Second thing is, and again, this is sort of obvious, but the better you do your job, the more valuable you will be to an employer. Again, that's obvious, but sort of, can't be emphasized enough, because a lot of the legal aspects, they're gray areas, and so the better you can build relationships, the more you can have mentors and allies, the more you can demonstrate your value to your employer, the more likely they are to be reasonable and even generous in providing an accommodation if you reach the point where you need one. My neurologist gave me some good advice when I was thinking about going on disability. He has a whole group of people, including social workers and different kind of therapists. And, he said, when people work for him ask for an accommodation in terms of reduced hours, he tends to be flexible, but he doesn't lower his standards in terms of quality. So, he's flexible on quantity, but not on quality. And I think that's what I found through my throughout my law career as well. So, as long as you maintain the quality, there is some wiggle room in terms of the amount of hours or the amount of sales you have to do, or the amount of deals you have to do. But you have to keep up the quality. So the ADA, I think everyone knows the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it has one section on title having to do with employment, and essentially, first of all, it defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. So specific things that are listed would be walking, for example, or breathing, or cooking. But in preparing for this, I looked up and I found that actually a number of years ago, they expanded the definition so that I think almost everybody, could be considered to have a disability. But one of the specific things is if you have a major impairment in your neuromuscular, or I'm sorry, your musculoskeletal function, that is a disability. So I think everybody that has muscular dystrophy, unless it's unbelievably mild, and even probably even then, would be considered to have a disability. And so the ADA employment provisions provide that an employer of 15 or more employees, whether it be a private employer or a state or local employer. Federal government is covered by a different law, and we'll go into that. But if you are able to perform the essential functions of a job, then you are, let's say, protected with respect to that job. And that is, if you're able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. And what is a reasonable accommodation is essentially any number of things, but it cannot be an undue hardship to the employer. So undue hardship basically means without too much difficulty or expense. And that's a very subjective definition. So, if you work for Google, what would be a reasonable accommodation for Google to provide is very different than if you work for, a retailer with 18 employees, or a startup with 18 or 20 or even 50 employees. So it depends both on the person, on the applicant or the employee, and on the employer. So I think one of the key questions is, what can the employer ask, both in terms of when you are interviewing for a job and later as an employee, and what should you disclose both when you are interviewing and later on? And I think that's a very, very tricky thing. An employer cannot ask, do you have a disability? Either before or after you are hired. But they can, if you have an obvious disability, they can ask whether you need a reasonable accommodation. So, I was lucky in that when I reached the point where I couldn't travel by myself, they did pay for my wife to travel with me, which was, I think, quite generous. But I didn't have to travel a lot, and particularly for the last number of years, a conference every now and then, Um, but, the firm had, a firm outing, like an overnight once or twice a year. Um, so that's really a matter of give and take between, you and the employer. Um, and whether the employer would be required legally to pay for someone to travel with you is probably, it depends on the job. It's probably not legally required. Now, in my outline, I mentioned that I have a friend, able-bodied, same age as me, 65. He's the national sales manager for a construction materials company. And even at our age, he's probably on a plane almost every week, maybe 40 trips a year. And he loves it, but although he is, starting to think about slowing down, but I would not recommend that type of a job or career for somebody with FSHD, because it's gonna, even if you can do it for, for a few years, it may wear you out. I mean, it may, you know, um, there's, there's the issue of um, doing your job, but there's also the issue of kind of wear and tear on your body. Um, so that's something to consider. Oh, leave of absence is another accommodation. Um, in my career in 20 years, I did take two leaves of absence. One from the railcar leasing company, and I really felt that I was at a point where my FSHD was progressing faster than it had for a while. And so I asked for a 3-month unpaid leave, which they agreed to. And so that would be a reasonable accommodation. But again, it depends on the job. Depends on the job and the company and whether somebody else can cover for you for that amount of time. So I would not say that it was, if push came to shove and they had, and the leasing company had said, no, we can't spare you. That's probably something, they might have been right. I mean, in other words, that's one of those gray areas or where there's a lot of give and take and where it has to do a lot with the particular job, the particular employee, the particular employer. The second time was at the last law firm that I worked for. And again, I just sort of felt like my progression was going faster than it had been for a while. And I just felt like I needed to step back a bit. And I asked for either 6 or 8 weeks, I forget which, unpaid, and they agreed. In fact, when I came back, they paid me, which was pretty nice, pretty generous. Um, I don't think under the ADA that that there would ever be a situation where being paid during a leave would be required of the employer. So they went beyond what was required. And then there was also the federal FMLA, Family and Medical Leave Act. And that is separate from the ADA, and that provides that every employee who needs to take care of a serious health or medical condition for themselves or for an immediate family member can take up to 12 weeks unpaid leave in a 12-month period. And so that's separate and apart from what might or might not be required under the ADA. So examples of taking care of a serious medical condition or health condition would be getting some kind of therapy, getting surgery, participating in a clinical trial, hint, hint. So, we need people to participate. I think Fulcrum does, and maybe some of the other ones that are going to be recruiting. And so, I think that if you need some time off, which might just be a day here and there to participate in a clinical trial, that would be something that would be covered. You would have rights to do that under the Family and Medical Leave Act.
Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't know that FMLA would cover time off for a clinical
I
trial.
mean, that's my guess.
Good.
I
Yeah.
don't know for sure.
It's good
But-
to at least make the request, because that wouldn't have
Yeah.
entered my thought process. So, we
And
have
I suppose that's. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, say Fulcrum is currently recruiting the MOVE study. It needs 200 more people. The Avidity trial just went on clinicaltrials.gov this week. So they're going to start recruiting. I think Roche is going to come online soon. So there is lots of opportunities for people to get involved in the clinical research. So I don't know that would have been top of mind for people to even make that request for that.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I haven't researched this, and I don't know whether there's any kind of ruling. I doubt whether there's any court case, but whether the EEOC or actually it's the Department of Labor that enforces the FMLA, whether they have any guidance about something like that. But I'm just extrapolating from
Sure.
if you need some days off to undergo a treatment, it would seem to be logical that you should also be entitled to days off to participate in a clinical trial. Oh, group insurance. Okay. Yeah. One of the key benefits of working for, a medium or large employer or a state or local government as well, is insurance. Health insurance is so expensive now. At least under the Affordable Care Act, everybody is entitled to health insurance, and you can't be charged more for having a pre-existing condition. So, you can't, you can't be charged more, for example, for having FSHD. But nevertheless, it's expensive if you have to get it on your own. There's also some employers provide life insurance, usually a small amount, but it's better than nothing. Many employers provide long-term disability insurance, and I have a whole separate document about long-term disability. But judging by everybody on the screen here that I can see, I don't think that's going to be relevant for many, 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 many years for any of you. But it is good to have long-term disability insurance if you, I mean, it's an important benefit if your employer provides it. And then as well, long-term care insurance. I have a caregiver every day for about 5 or 6 hours to help me in the morning and then with lunch. I've got 3 guys that split the week. And I'm really lucky to have very good long-term care insurance, which the law firm I worked at offered at the employee's expense. It was optional, but you could sign up for long-term care insurance for the employee and the spouse. My wife and I, took it, and so that's paying for my caregivers right now. Now that is very hard insurance to find. They don't write policies like this one anymore, but nevertheless, there might be some long-term care insurance that your employer might provide. If you are thinking about starting your own business, you got to consider all of these insurances. I mean, again, what does health insurance cost? Are you going to have to pay, $1,000 or $1,200 a month for health insurance that's not even that great? Plus, life insurance, long-term disability. The other thing is that some professional organizations, church organizations, alumni groups offer group policies of life insurance or long-term disability. Lee has my contact info. Well, I guess Zach and Kiara do also. If you have any questions or thoughts or want some more information, feel free to to shoot me an email.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome.